You joining us in person, joining us on Zoom, Liz. Nice to see you. All those who are watching on Facebook, or if you're listening on podcast, or listening on watching on YouTube, we really appreciate you learning with us, choosing to spend some time learning Torah today. We're so excited to continue our learning of Ein Yaakov, which we are now putting online, but we've been learning together in person for a while. You guys don't have coffee? No coffee?
Not for me.
Not for you. You got some coffee? Yeah, good. Thank God. I was worried, and so we're going to continue learning Ein Yaakov, and we're on the 49th teaching from this wonderful book of legends. And just because I'm figuring we probably have some new people learning with us online, I'll explain a little bit about what Ein Yaakov is before we jump into the content for today. Ein Yaakov is a collection, an anthology of Talmudic legends and Talmudic stories, homilies. The Talmud is a document that was redacted by the rabbis, the great rabbis, which we call the Moraim, in 500 CE. Their collected thought is really from around 200 to 500 CE in the land of Israel and in Babylon, which were the two real centers of the Jewish community at the time. 80% of the Talmud is legal analysis and legal discussion, very complicated legal analysis, but kind of thrown throughout the Talmud is about 20% of rabbinic legends, stories, biblical interpretations, homilies, ethical teachings, and that is really important. The legal analysis stuff is really important, but really really meant for rabbinic scholars, people who are deciding law, that kind of thing. But the legendary material and the ethical material is so important for everybody, and is inspiring just the way it is. So what Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chaviv did, this great rabbi from the 15th century, went and took all of the Agadot, or all this legendary, this 20% of material out of the Talmud, and put it all into one collection. He called it Ein Yaakov, which is the Wellspring of Jacob. It's his name, Jacob. And so it really became a text that is studied in many Batei Midrash, many different yeshivas, and many different shtibelach in Eastern Europe and shuls. Really mainly learned between Mincha and Mariv. There was like a 30-minute break in between, and it really was what was taught by the rabbis in those communities to lay people, to inspire them to understand what Jewish values, Jewish ethics are, and to really take out this material. So he did a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now they've translated this wonderful collection into English. ArtScroll has done it in such a wonderful way with a beautiful commentary that the edition we use. So if you'd like to figure out the edition that we use and to learn with us, you can always ask me by emailing me at rmr@templeofaaron.org, and I'm happy to get back to you on that. For now, of course, we'll share the text on the screen, but let's begin with our blessing as you turn it over. So let's say our blessing for Torah study. All right, everybody. Well, it's so nice to be here, and let's start our learning. So let me share the text on the screen for you all so you guys can see. Just give me a second here as I do this. Okay, let's stay co-host. Share my screen. Sorry for all the technical stuff, everybody, but important.
You're building a circle.
Exactly. All right, so I think we should see the text now on the page, which is cool. All right, so just get rid of whatever this is. I don't want to open Microsoft Copilot. Okay. All right, everybody. Well, we're here. We're on the 49th teaching of Ein Yaakov, and in previous classes, we've been really looking. The Gemara really is in a place right now. This is the 10th daf of Brachot, the 10th page of Tractate Brachot, on dealing with heretics, and how we deal with people who don't believe like us or don't think like us, and sort of how to deal with this. And what we see the Gemara is responding, is telling us that we should respond with diligence, we should respond with truth, we shouldn't be afraid have these conversations and to tell what the truth is. But there is a sort of a line of not getting too angry, not too frustrated, and this kind of thing. And so this is really an instance where there's a particular, it's not just a heretic who just happens to be out there, but a heretic who is challenging you on your Judaism, right? So it's okay. They're just going to be a heretic. They're going to not believe, but they're not challenging you on what you do, right? That's called America, right? But if they're saying that you can't do what you do and you're wrong, right? Then as Jews, we have to defend our tradition, defend our faith, defend Judaism. And this is, of course, part of how we sanctify God's name in the world by defending the Torah, right? Because the Torah and our tradition represents God in this way. So,
question. When we say heretic, are they referring only to a Jewish heretic or to anybody?
So here in particular, it's referring to a Jewish, mostly a Jewish heretic we're bumping into. The kind of heretics we'll bump into this particular passage is called a Stuki in Hebrew, or a Sadducee in English. And these were, you have to understand the time of, especially in the time of the Mishnah, and somewhat in the time of the rabbis, the later rabbis of the Talmud as well, there's a lot of schisms in the Jewish community. You probably are not surprised by this. It's we know this. But back then, there really was no. For a long time, there was no party that was sort of winning the battle of who's the true Judaism, and they were wildly different from each other. So we had the Pharisees, who were like our rabbis and believed in Rabbinic Judaism, and their focus was to take the Torah away from the temple, right, and kind of bring it into every home, and that Judaism is really based on learning Torah. Each individual Jew learning Torah and teaching it and doing mitzvot in their own lives. Well, the really Sadducees sort of represented the old way, which is a temple-centered Judaism. So Jews, obviously Sadducees were only around when the temple was around, and basically it was really a temple-centered Judaism. It wasn't based on individual practice as much as really as being centered on the worship of God at the temple. And there are other movements around it as well. Eventually, all these other movements died out, except basically two: Christianity and Judaism. Right? Christianity was another one of these Jewish movements at the time when it started. But regardless, what we call Judaism now really is Pharisaic Judaism at the time. So anyway, so we're really dealing with different sects or different kinds of Jews. Of course, you're reading a document written by the Pharisaic Jews, so they would call what the Sadducees were. I would say from the perspective of modern Judaism and modern Rabbinic Judaism, we follow the Pharisaic Jews. We are Pharisaic Jews. We're not Sadducee Jews. That's not who we descend from. Our tradition is from the rabbis. The Talmud is the Pharisaic text and the Mishnah in that regard. So, obviously we're getting a partial opinion here. But I think these they're juicy stories, but they also answer some important questions for us, to teach us some important lessons. So let's begin. So teaching 49. Another exchange involving a heretic and a righteous person. Someone to read here?
Sure. A certain Sadoki, am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
Once said to Rav Abahu, "It is written in Tehillim, a song by David as he fled from Avshalom his son. And further on in the book of Tehillim, it is written by David a michtam when he fled from Shaul in the cave. Which incident occurred earlier? David's fleeing from Shaul or his fleeing from Avshalom? Now, certainly the incident with Shaul occurred earlier because it happened when Shaul, who ruled before David, was king, while the incident with Avshalom occurred after David was already king.
Okay.
The prayer, when he fled from Shaul, should therefore have been written earlier."
Okay, so you have to understand this is a time, all these texts were relatively young at this time, and There was a lot of arguments about what is going to be canonized into the Bible and what is not. And you can see here that there's a little bit of this text of the Psalms that we've collected. There probably always was these like Hebrew writings that were around. But then choosing specifically which ones are going to be in and which ones are going to be out, that was a decision that had to be made by the Jewish leaders at the time.
And it sounds like which order as well.
Right. So the argument that the Tzedeki is bringing up to Rabbi Abahu is what? What is his argument?
Well, they should be chronological.
Right. So that the Psalms should be in chronological order of David's life. Right. And what's the problem with this?
It's out of order, I guess.
Very out of order, right? So first David fled from Shaul, right? Shaul was the first king of Israel, and he had to flee from Shaul because Shaul was very jealous and tried to kill David. And this was really in his youth before he was king. And Absalom happened when David was already king. So you know that the Absalom incident, I mean, Absalom is David's son, so you understand. It's kind of sad that David had to run from two different people. One is his mentor, Shaul, or his original person he worked for, and then his own son, Absalom. So this is kind of sad in itself. But we see that the psalm about that is described as a song by David when he fled from Absalom is in chapter 3 of Psalms. And the one by David when he fled from Shaul, according to the Psalms, is in chapter 57. So the Tzeduki's question is, what's the Tzeduki's problem?
Why is it out of order?
Good. Why is it out of order? It should be in chronological order, right? So, and of course, what he's really trying to do is probably his sort of underlying goal is to undermine these texts, is undermine rabbinic authority, that you don't know what you're talking about, this is wrong. So he's trying to challenge Rabbi Abahu sort of as a representative of that tradition. Would you like to keep going?
Sure. For you heretics who do not expound the significance of the placement of scriptural passages next to one another, this sequence poses a difficulty. For us loyal Jews, however, who expound the significance of the placement of scriptural passages next to one another, this sequence poses no difficulty. The reason the chapter regarding Avshalom was placed at the book's beginning, even though the story of Avshalom occurred after the later mentioned story of David's flight from Shaul, was in order to teach us something by its placement next to another chapter at the beginning of the book.
So I think this is really important, and I think this really does show a very good difference between the Sadducees and the Tzedukim at the time, right? The Sadducees, not only were they temple-centric, they were very into, Greek logic and science. They were the Hellenistic Jews, who were very integrated into Roman society and knew Roman sciences in that regard. And so they really read the Torah very literally. They read the Torah. And so, for example, one of the most famous cases of a disagreement between the Sadducees and the Saddukim, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, is about placement of tefillin. So in the mitzvah, right, in the language of Shema, it says that you should place these or bind these between thine eyes. So if I was to say, if you read the text and say, place the tefillin between thine eyes, where would you think to put it?
Yeah, right there.
Right there, right? And it makes sense. You got this nice flat place right here, and you just put the thing right there, right between your eyes. That's the way the Sadducees interpreted it, that commandment. So when the Sadducees were tefillin, they put it right there, right? The Pharisees, on the other hand, said, no, it's between thine eyes, but it's not supposed to be down here. Rather, they found a way from Scripture to interpret it that it would be right up here, sort of where like a unicorn horn, almost like that, like right where your hairline is supposed to be. And from this day on,
it depends on your hairline.
Right, or where what we should be, exactly used to be, right? This is important, right? Good point. So this was the disagreement between them to this day. So as it's very important that we wear our tefillin on where our hairline used to be in the good old days, right? And then why are we doing that? Because we're saying by doing that, look, we're not a Sadducees, we're a Pharisees. We're following this camp or this sect of Jews, right? And so it's something I correct all the time, because if you just put on tefillin, right, you think that, oh, it should just go right here, right? And But I think besides the real world application, I think it shows the logic of the Sadducees is that they really try to read the Torah pretty literally. And so I think we see that here in that the rabbis are willing to say, well, the placement of the Torah, where the Psalms are placed in the Psalms, have a lot to do with their semantic meaning that you can interpret, that you can make these fancy drashot, connecting them together. Sadducees is not willing to do that as well. They're going to say it's going to be something simple, like chronological. The Psalms are in chronological order. It's going to make the most. Think of it, if Aristotle was reading the Psalms, what would he assume, you know? And so it's a very different way of sort of looking at the Torah. I think the rabbis sort of have a little bit of like a mystical way of looking at the Torah, which the Sadducees don't really. And of course, the reason for that is to maintain authority amongst the Kohanut and amongst the priests and amongst the temple. Because
that's not a good argument, actually. So, well, because I guess I can make an argument for the sake of heaven. I know that I'm taking the heretic side of this, but I'm more persuaded by that, which is that there's something revelatory in the order in which things happen. That there is a lesson. I can understand that people are, you're taking something later in time and earlier in time, and you're putting them side by side so that you can understand, that theme or that arc within that idea. But sometimes the order in which things happen, and that God orders things to happen, is revelatory in the lesson that we're supposed to receive. So, I could see an argument which is, no, I want to experience it in order because that's the way David experienced it, and how we're supposed to learn from it.
Yeah, I don't think the Sadducees are making like horrible arguments here. And I think it's also important. Again, when you look at the Art Scroll, when you're reading an Art Scroll, most of the time we don't work off of Art Scroll translations because they're somewhat problematic in their particular interpretation. We really like to read the actual translation of the text itself. But in this particular case, we use it because it really is a nice addition. But we use it with the understanding that, again, they're adding words in that aren't in the text. So, just to look at that particular passage that was brought up. So when Rabbi Abahu says, Rabbi, look what's bold and what's not bold, right? Rabbi Abahu said to him, for you, and then heretics, right? Heretics is not bolded, right? So it doesn't say heretics. It just says, for you who do not expound the placement of scriptural passages next to one another, this poses a difficulty, right? For you, those who haven't seen this online, the non-bold is Art Scroll interpretation, usually taken from medieval commentaries like Rashi and everything like that. It's still a particular interpretation, right? And then for us, and then it adds in loyal Jews, right? Which is kind of, it makes it very animist, but here it just says, for us who expound the significance of the placement of scriptural passages next to one another, this poses no difficulty, right? So the Talmud doesn't seem to have heat in it that the Art Scroll is putting, right? And I think you can read that. Again, Art Scroll is an ultra-Orthodox publisher. They are a wonderful publisher, but they're going to we should understand their worldview, right? That what is wrong is what is not the right path of Judaism is completely wrong. It's heresy, right? These are the worst, right? Talmud doesn't seem to be using that level of language, but if you're ultra-Orthodox and the world is a little bit more black and white, you might be more attracted to that sort of tone, if that makes sense. Does that make sense so far?
Indeed.
So very interesting, and I think we can really see here the difference between Sadducees and Pharisaic understanding of the Torah. But of course, I think the Pharisaic understanding of the Torah really adds a lot, right? Adds a lot of creativity, right? The Sadducees you might be 100% right that it adds more information, right? By knowing the chronology, you're 100% right. But that's like more of a scientific understanding, right? The Pharisaic understanding is a little bit more creative, interpretive, and because they're being
thematic,
right? The reason that they're and what this actually causes is sort of a side effect, or you can argue it's a primary effect, or the intended purpose. It depends on what you want to say. Is that they're able to be creative? They're able to move Judaism along and say, okay, well, if I make this creative interpretation, it's really creative, but it also changes things so that I can make a Judaism that's not temple-centered, right? And then once the temple was destroyed, they kind of became the perfect Judaism, right? Make sense so far?
So were they doing the non-temple related Judaism before the temple was destroyed? Or was it when they went to
A lot of people argue about that. From the traditional perspective, from the rabbinic perspective, if I was talking to from their perspective, I would say yes, they were doing. Moshe Rabbeinu was doing this. If you read the Gemara, it believes that Abraham was doing this even before Moshe was doing this. They had all intuited the oral Torah. Scholars, actual, historical scholars in the secular world. This is to this day they argue over this. How old are rabbinic traditions? Just because they didn't go back to Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai doesn't mean that they don't go back. Doesn't mean they're not oral traditions, right? They just might not be 3,000 years old. They might be 200 years old, right? Which, imagine if you're doing a 200-year-old tradition, that's a pretty, all of the traditions in this country are basically 300 years old. So, we think of them as pretty old,
So, would Sadoki be in the same category as Korach for these folks?
A little different. What do you mean by the same category?
Well, in rebellion.
Right, they're rebelling against so I would say yes, they do.
A significant threat to the current order and stability of Am Yisrael.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comparison, and I think like rebellion is the right word, 100%. It's hard to say that the Pharisees, though, that the Sadducees are the ones that are rebelling. Probably from a historical perspective, the Pharisees.
Wow, that's great.
Just from a historical perspective, because the Torah was. If you read the Torah, the Kohanut is central. They're the teachers. They're the children of Aaron. But one reason that it's also, I think, different than the Korach rebellion is they're sort of arguing opposite. Like it's actually the Pharisees who are arguing more of the Korach way of thinking. Right? They're saying everybody is capable of practicing Judaism as long as they can learn Torah. Right? If you learn Torah, you don't have to be a child of Aaron. You don't have to be some kind of royalty. You don't have to be near a temple. Anyone could practice Judaism as long as they're able to learn Torah and do mitzvot. Right? Thank God that's our Judaism today. The Sadducees' Judaism really was more about, right, there are these Kohanim, right, who are the leaders, and they inherit their position based on a dynasty, right, as being children of Aaron. If I was to intuit, I'd say that is more like Moshe saying, Moshe is the leader, God chose, right? While Korah saying everyone's holy, right? At least if you take the argument on its surface. So it's an interesting comparison, right?
I have a question about the word Sadoki.
Sure.
Does it come from the root of Sadak?
Sadok HaKohen. That's what it comes from originally. Sadok HaKohen was a Kohen, and so these are the disciples of Sadok, right?
Okay.
That's the idea. All right, so let's see where the story goes from here. We're comfortable keep moving?
Sure.
Let's keep it moving.
The Gemara interrupts Rav Abahu's answer to present the source for his claim that the side-by-side placement of scriptural passages has significance. For Rav Yochanan said, "From where in the Torah do we learn that the placement next to each other of seemingly unrelated scriptural passages may be expounded? For it is stated, trusted are all his commandments. They are joined forever, for eternity. They, that is, the joined passages, are made in truth and uprightness." This teaches that the joining of various passages in Scripture is not random, but is meant to convey to us certain truths. Every such joining, then, may be expounded. It is for this reason that David's prayer for deliverance from the hands of Avshalom comes out of sequence. It is positioned next to the chapter that precedes it for the purpose of teaching us something.
Good. All right. So it's supposed to be next to Psalm 2, right? That's what it's saying. So this is Psalm 3. It's supposed to be next to Psalm 2, even though it's out of chronological. Right now, let's understand the verse that he's sort of getting this from. What does this verse say?
I think it says the opposite.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's first understand, what does the verse say?
For it is stated, right?
Yeah, just read the verse because there might be people.
For it is stated, they are joined forever for eternity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that suggests a daisy chain beginning at Sinai and extending infinitely.
Right.
You're not supposed to put them out of order. There's an arc here. In fact, it's an arc that stretches to eternity, and you're messing it up.
Right. No,
to make a thematic point.
Right, but I think the mistake here you're making, for me at least, is that the order is that the third chapter is later, and the 50, whatever this is, the 57th chapter is earlier chronological. We know that's the order. We know we already have an order that is not chronological. We know it's not chronological, right? It's not like, so what the rabbis are saying is, well, there's wisdom to this. And it seems that the Sadducees don't seem to be even suggesting a solution, but I would think their solution was switch the order, make it clear, right? And the Pharisees are saying, specifically Rabbi Yochanan here, is that they're joined this way for a reason, right? That's what the Psalms are saying, and that there's truth and uprightness in the fact that they're chosen. And I think what this does, honestly, is it makes it an eternal document in a different way, right? On the one hand, yes, every text is from a certain place, and everything happens in a certain chronological order. But I think we're encouraged when we're looking at Torah and we're looking at Talmud, we're looking at any sacred text. They should be eternal. They should apply to us in the time in which we're living forever and ever and ever. They shouldn't only be attached to one particular time and place. And I think this is sort of the way in which the rabbis sort of internalize the message of the Torah and the passage of the Torah in order, this is the way they do it, by saying it all talks to each other, that it's all one part of one long conversation. And that's the way it goes. I think this really lends us an important point to make that I really want to make sure we make, is that I say this to you all the time, but I think it's important to say it over and over and remind ourselves, when we look at sacred texts, right, we should look at them as the words of the Psalm says, that they are made in truth and uprightness, right? That there is something truthful and upright about our sacred texts, and that in the specific way they are, and it really is our job to learn from them and understand why they are like that and what lessons the text has to teach us, to come in with a certain amount of faith that those texts teach us. Not like the Sadducees who say, well, this text is just wrong, we should rearrange it, right? That's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to say there's wisdom in this, and I have to figure it out, that I haven't understood it yet, and I need to understand it in a deeper way. I think that's how a Jew should learn sacred text. And that's what makes, learning in synagogue different than learning in university, where you're really told to be critical, right? And to be critical in order to defeat the argument, right? And then the best argument wins. The Torah doesn't work like that in that regard. There's wisdom in each argument that's made, and it's up to us to be able to understand and absorb the wisdom of our teachers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I agree. I just think that I guess the in group is being uncharitable, I think, or maybe not as.
Who's the in group?
Well, the in group is the Ravs. The Ravs.
The Pharisees.
Well, the Pharisees, yes. And
yeah.
And so the challengers. Again, I think these are arguments for the sake of heaven, and I think you can concede the point that if you're trying to do a meditation on flight, or the occasions which make us fearful and having to flee either from our patrons or our sons, those joining them together makes a thematic point that's really important.
Very important. They're not joined, right? Psalm 3 and Psalm 57 are pretty far apart.
Oh, yes.
So that's, at least in that way, it's not, right? It's joined. I think it's going to say next, right, why it's going to be attached to chapter 2. So maybe that's good. Why don't we use that as a transition point and move on with the sugya here and the discussion to understand why Psalm 3 is attached to Psalm 2, right? And maybe we'll understand in a deeper way what we mean here as deriving meaning from this smuchim, or deriving meaning from the fact that teachings are next to each other outside of chronological order. So let's keep going. You want to keep us going here?
Sure. The purpose is now explained. Why was the chapter regarding Avshalom, which is chapter 3 in Tehillim, put next to the chapter containing the prophecy about the war of Gog and Magog against Hashem, which is chapter 2? So that if a person says to you, how can the prophet...
Before we get into the answer, right, but you did a great job, right? So the teaching about Avshalom is chapter 3, right? That's David's son, and when he was fleeing from Avshalom. It's a beautiful psalm, chapter 3, right? Chapter 2 is really a psalm about... We can even look at it if you want. It's a psalm specifically where the psalmist is very angry at God for not punishing the nations, for not doing what God is supposed to, and that God should do something. And for the rabbis, this hints at the time of Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog comes out of really a prophecy from Yechezkel chapter 38 through 39, right? When this kind of final battle between the nations is happening, between the anointed ones of God and the non-anointed ones. That's what Gog and Magog really sort of represent, the final battle before Mashiach comes, or the final battle of the Mashiach itself. So that's sort of what that is all about. So let's see what they have to do with each other.
So that if a person says to you, how can the prophecy about Gog and Magog making war against Hashem be true? Is there ever a servant who rebels against his master? You can respond to him, and is there ever a son who rebels against his father? Nevertheless, we see that it did happen when Avshalom rebelled against his father David. Here too, then, regarding the rebellion of Gog and Magog against God, it will one day happen.
Good. Okay, so in some ways, like if there's an actual God of the world, right, who is the God of the entire world, it would be ridiculous to fight against that God, right? If that God said Eretz Yisrael is for the Jewish people, right? Fine, right? There's nothing I can do. It's God, right? It's ridiculous to fight against it. But it seems what Gog and Magog are saying is we're fighting for social and economic reasons. We're trying to get rid of the Jewish people here for economic reasons, for some political purpose. But their real purpose internally is the uprooting of the Jewish people and the uprooting of God, right? It's a rebellion against God. And so you might say, according to the Gemara here, how could someone possibly rebel against God like this? It's ridiculous. It's like someone rebelling against their own father. Who would ever do that? And of course, we have a great example of doing that with Absalom and David. I think that's really really important. So that's an important concept that really anyone can rebel on. Sometimes it's the people who are closest to us who rebel the worst, right? So that is often true. A lot of times we think.
Well, you're going to find out with your girls.
Exactly, children, 100% that's true. But I think this is really important. At least what I see in this, I think this is really important. Is it's so easy to look out at other people and say, what that guy is doing is so wrong. Who would ever do that? What Gog and Magog are doing, how could they ever rebel against God? Unbelievable. It's ridiculous, right? And then the Gemara says, well, look in your own backyard. It's actually not so distant from what happens to you, right? You do the same things in your family and the same things happen. So don't be, so judgmental. This stuff happens. This is a great example of this, of saying it happened in the Mashiach, and David's own family, the greatest king of Israel of all time, had a lot of brokenness in his family, and a lot of children rebelling against their parents and everything like that. So I think this really has a message here of not judging, right, and really saying that people deal with stuff, right, in their lives, right, and we should give them some grace. And understand that never be shocked by a problem that might happen of rebellion in this world, because rebellion is a natural way of being a human being. We love to rebel against everything. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I have a thought about the out of chronological order. This is sort of a side thing. Because it occurred to me, we believe that God exists where there is no time. So what would the chronological order be to God? Probably not much, because I don't know, maybe I'm just extrapolating,
but he gets his own jokes. The Torah is for us.
Yeah, I suppose.
But I think you make a really great concept, right? That there is no time for God, right? That everything is, thematic, I think, for God. God, what God really is about is not telling you history, it's giving you a message.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you make a really important point, actually. It's a really
the side by side is how you get to the message as opposed to
exactly
a calendar.
Yeah. Look, I think that's always the question.
Maybe. I think sometimes we all have third acts. Things go in an arc. I think storytelling. And so, I guess I'm not so quick to dismiss that the order in which things are revealed to us. Well, we a couple weeks back we had should we tell them the end? No. Let's wait off on thing. And so I think that I think God is an author as well as an engineer. Absolutely,
Right.
He's a storyteller.
Exactly. So and I think that it's important to ask, what is the function of the Torah? Right? What is the function of the Psalms or the function of these sacred texts? Is it to narrate a history? Is it to tell a particularly historically, factually correct story and to stay close to historical fact? I think we can be pretty sure that didn't really make the cut on that, right? I think there's a lot of ways where the Torah is not historical or leaves out important details of stuff that actually happened in history. But I think if we can understand the purpose of the Torah is it comes from the name Torah to instruct, right? To teach us, to illuminate us, to help us, to instruct us how we're supposed to live our lives.
So that our lives are better.
Right.
Become better.
Exactly. So that our lives are better, right? Then I think we'd say, yeah, that's the point of the Torah, right? And so therefore, that's also the point of the arrangement of the Psalms and the way in which the Bible is constructed to teach us the messages that are going to be important about how we live our lives, right? And I think that's what used to drive me crazy. I can't tell you how many conservative synagogues I've been to specifically, where you can't wait to hear the rabbi sermon. He's about to give the sermon, it's going to be great, or the Bar Torah, or the Bar Tefillah, or whatever it is, and you're ready to be inspired. But instead, the rabbi talks to you about the age of a particular psalm or a particular text, that it was from this age, and and makes an argument about the age of the text. It's like, okay, I'm glad you gave me the history lesson, but what does this have to do with me? And if someone's left saying to themselves, what does this have to do with me? The rabbi or the teacher has not done their job when it comes to Torah. Now, if it was a history class, right? If it was a social studies class or an ancient history class, they would have done their job. And I think that's why it's so important to define what is the function of Torah and what are we supposed to be accomplishing. Does that make sense? And it's for that reason that Psalm 2 and Psalm 3 were put next to each other. So God is willing to sacrifice the chronological clarity for this important message, right? Because that's how important this message is to God. That it is very believable to rebel against God. I think a lot of us think, well, the reason we rebel against God is because we're not sure that God is really there, right? Or that we don't know if we really believe. And if God was right in front of us and it was super clear that God was there, we wouldn't rebel any longer.
Well, I think some people rebel against God because they're absolutely certain God exists.
So then they rebel against God because
they're scared. I think they're frightened by the fact that there is something out there, and maybe they don't understand it.
Right. It's kind of a ridiculous thing to think that if you really believe God exists, why would you run away from that God? I mean, we have stories like that, like in Job and everything like that. Yeah. I'm sorry, not Job. Yeah, Jonah, I meant. But yeah, it would seem in the logical mind to think that it would be ridiculous to rebel against God.
But we're not logical.
And look, I still think it's this day when people say to me, I'm an atheist, or I'm I don't believe, or what have you. I kind of laugh in my head because I think human beings naturally connect with God and naturally are connected with God all the time as creatures of God, and they're living in God. It's the reality in which they're living, right? It's funny when people define this as not happening when it's not really a choice, right? You kind of live in God, right? If God is, then God is, right? And God isn't, then God isn't, right? And so it's a very interesting thing. And I think people experience God all the time in their lives. They just fail to define it as God.
Or recognize it, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's really going to be important. All right. So I think this is a good place to end as we get to the next teaching. I think we've learned a lot from this particular teaching. I think really the take-home lessons from today, which are going to be really important, we'll go on to teaching 50 next week, or next time we have class. The take-home teachings, one, is how we talk to a heretic. We don't talk to a heretic in nasty words. We don't curse them out. We reply with confidence. And of course, when talking to a heretic, I think it's always important to remember the purpose. What is the intention? What is the purpose of what I am trying to do in this world? Right? What is the purpose of the Torah? What is it a factual document? Is it a document that's actually supposed to, we're going to just argue over truth, or is what really matters the teaching over how to live one's life? Right? And of course, the Pharisees and Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Yonachan here go with the semantic meaning as being most important, and saying what the Torah has to teach us is what's most important, not the facts in that way. And I think that's a really great orienting principle for us as we learn Torah together and we try to ask for it to affect our lives, to change our lives, to transform our lives. I'll see you next time, everybody.
Sounds good.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, you bet.